Welcome to Labor and Community for an Independent Party. In recognition of International Workers' Day, May Day, the Greater Cleveland Immigrant Support Network and Labor and Community for an Independent Party co-hosted a virtual rally, Labor and Community for Immigrant and Refugee Families, moderated by Don Bryant.
Today, as we introduce the program Virtual Rally for International Workers' Day 2021, I'd like to introduce Desiree Rojas, President of the Labor Council for Latin American Advancement, Sacramento, California, AFL-CIO. She's the daughter of Al and Elena Rojas, co-founders of the United Farm Workers Union, who moved their family to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to organize the grape boycott and later the tomato strike in Yolo County, California. For over 45 years, Desiree has been organizing teachers, farm workers, women, and indigenous communities at the side of her father, Albert Rojas. Desiree currently serves on the California Progressive Alliance Steering Committee that is the alternative voice for the two-party structure. I want to give my condolences to Desiree from us regarding the loss of her father just recently. Presente, Al Rojas. Desiree, I have a question for you regarding the devastating crisis of immigrant detention and poor labor standards and laws that regulate the immigrant and labor force of our migrants. You've been in this field for quite a while, and you're out there in the area where a lot of this is going on in California. Could you give us some sense of what's been going on since around the year 2000 and beyond?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you, John, for welcoming me into this program and this panel for Primero de Mayo. And to all the workers out there, today is our day to really talk about the issues. Every day is, but today's a significant day. As you know, it's an International Workers' Day, May Day, and it's a very important day. In Sacramento as well, we're going to have a caravana with joint union from SEIU, Local 1000, 2015, Unite Here, LACLA, the Sacramento Central Labor Council, and DSA, YOLO, DSA, Sacramento, and a lot of organizations. We're going to get together and do a caravana for the fight for the 15 and also for justice for farm workers. And the farm workers, not only in California, in San Quintin, but also in India, because this is an international struggle. And answering your question, Brother Don, the real issue is the foreign policies that dictate how workers are going to be treated. Bill Clinton enacted and got the first NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, foreign policy signed, and CAFTA. And now we have the NAFTA 2.0, which is another diabolical, our draconian agreement that does not protect workers. In fact, it has created a part of the environmental catastrophe that we see before us with the climate change. And it's a policy that it was created that protects trinational corporations, and it causes forced migration. My father has been talking about forced migration for over 40 years. What forced migration means is that foreign policies like NAFTA force the original peoples. In Mexico, we say original peoples. Here in the United States, we say indigenous people, force them from their pueblos, their communities, and it breaks their indigenous, their original people's communities economy that has been in place for hundreds of years. When NAFTA came in, they flooded the market with the NGO corn that ended in damaging not only the ecosystems of these areas, but it forced people to leave and to seek employment in neighboring states and into the United States. And when they wanted to return, they no longer had a pueblo or a community. The people were separated. The root of the problem is the foreign policies that crush the economies in countries and affect indigenous communities and our environment. And what comes later is ICE prisons. What comes later is the NGO to help organizations with asylum families. And this is where we have to pull the root out, is with these foreign policies. Look, Everybody wants the same thing in life all around the world, a right to survive, a decent life, and health care for all, and to protect their children and to have education. We live in the fifth largest economy in the world, and the Democratic Party cannot get us health care for all. Why? Because it will cause a domino effect in the country, and the rest of the states will get it as well. But when you look at the minimum wage of what's going on in Kentucky, West Virginia, and Oklahoma and Georgia, it's despicable. When you look at the federal minimum wage, it's despicable. We have over 400 million families that are out of work, that lost their jobs. What's the question of the year? Did they keep their health care, or did they lose it? They lost it. And the most impacted communities are people of color and poor white people in the Rust Belt of this country. So what we're talking about is poverty, jobs, and we're talking about workers who are forced to migrate. The immigration issue right now, we are all complicit. LACLA has been out protesting. LACLA is one of many organizations that force the California Public Retirement System to move the portfolio money of members out of the GEO and Civic Corps portfolios, to move it out of those portfolios somewhere else. So we got them, I don't want to use the word divest, but we got them to move that money out of those portfolios. That took a protest, and that took the sheriffs and the state police and the local police at our throats there, but we didn't give up. We fought back because we knew that those ICE prisons had to be shut down, like they still need to be. They are federal contract with the taxpayers' money. They're abusing families, separating children, and these are concentration camps. And this is the end result of foreign policies that have gone wrong, like NAFTA and CAFTA. That is the root problem. And we believe that in order to talk about fair wages and the protection of farm workers and essential workers on the front line, we have to deal with these foreign policies. And the other issue is federal Cal OSHA. Where is federal Cal OSHA? Where is Cal OSHA in all the states and in California? Why are they not going into the industrial front line of these essential workers and protecting them, like in chicken plants and like in beef plants and egg plants and not just farm workers, but other plants. We have indigenous people in these positions working as in indentured servitude. So where is the protection of these workers? We can't just rely on legislation. We have to rely on Cal OSHA, and we have to rely on the government oversight that is actually going to protect workers. And that's not happening enough. We need our national unions, the AFL-CIO, and we need Change to Win to really start coming down on Cal OSHA and to say, do your job. It's time for you to do your job. And if you can't do it for you, then maybe we need to make some changes and get people to actually do the job inside of Cal OSHA. They could hire 2,000 people right now or all over the country in each state as temporary workers and train them to go in on the front line to protect workers. And they haven't done that. That language in there's a chapter written, I know in California, because I talked to one of the previous directors at Cal OSHA, and he told me there is already provisions in place in case of an emergency crisis that we can go in and we can literally go in and protect workers and conduct some oversight. But that's not happening. So getting back to the root problem, it's the foreign policies like NAFTA and CAFTA, the foreign policies that have allowed trinational corporations to go in and to union bust and to break down the spirit of workers and to move people in like a grinding machine and like a herd of cows. You know, we're done with you. We got a new group of workers. We'll go into private contract with states from Mexico or from different countries to bring workers in instead of protecting workers. No one's talking about the international workers for our Silicon Valley and all of this high-tech industry. Look at all the international workers that they're hiring all around the world. Nobody's talking about fair wages for those workers because it's classism. They're looked upon of having a better job because they get higher pay and because it's a technical that has to do a technical level positions that have to do with computer programming, engineering, etc. But they forget that the food that's on their table, the vegetables and the fruits and the vegetables that are on the shelves of thousands, if not millions of markets in this country come from the hands of farm workers. So you tell me what is more important, to feed people or to turn on your computer? And to this day, farm workers are still abused. We have over 80,000 farm workers alone picking the Driscoll berries for Driscoll and Andrew Williamson. We're still on the Driscoll boycott. You know, we've got workers there that are still making poor wages, and they're living in makeshift houses, and there's no water, no plumbing. How can you say that you're going to buy those berries when people are suffering when they're picking those berries? So what I say to all my comrades around the world, continue with the boycott, continue sharing, continue the dialogue, continue to talk about the protections of workers and hold people accountable. Because it's not right for people to be up on the ivory tower talking about protecting workers when they should be doing more. And getting back to that, the rank and file must start organizing in their unions. They must start organizing and taking the power back, and they must start driving their unions. If you have a union and the majority of the e-board is not rank and file and they're people and they're agents of a union, then your union is not a union. It's operating like a corporation, and we have to stop that.
Thank you, Desiree. Those are excellent marching orders. We have to continue the boycott on the berries, Driscoll, and the other Prince Edwards, I think you said. We must continue the boycotts and the struggle, talk out to our unions, and speak to our legislators. Thank you very much, Desiree, for opening up our virtual rally today in Cleveland, and you're talking to us from California, Sacramento.
Hasta la victoria siempre. Aquí estamos y no nos vamos. Boycott Driscoll.
Right on. Thank you so much. Have a great May Day.
You too.
Next up, I would like to introduce, welcome Luis, and welcome others that came on a little late. And just to say, I'm Don, and I'm with the Greater Cleveland Immigrant Support Network. I'm the co-chair. I would like to introduce our second speaker. Luis Angel is a removal defense attorney and is himself undocumented, one of the first undocumented attorneys in the country. He has been active in the immigrant rights movement since the historic general strikes of March and May 2006. In 2015, after graduating from NYU School of Law, Luis Angel joined Pangea Legal Services, where he represents detained immigrants. He's a member of Free Them All campaign and the Papeles para Todos campaign, which organized to abolish immigrant detention centers and win legalization for all 11 million undocumented immigrants. Welcome to you, Luis.
Thank you, Don. Greetings, everybody. Happy International Workers' Day. It is a pleasure to be here with you all. I just got back from the San Francisco rally here in California, where there was at least, I would say, 5,000 people marching for workers' rights, immigrant rights, and all rights of the oppressed in this country, and going right after this to San Jose. And so I just note this to say that it's a pleasure to be here with folks in Cleveland, and to be able to speak about the struggles happening around immigrant rights. Like Don mentioned, I will be speaking today not just as a immigrant rights attorney, as a removal defense attorney that has now been fighting deportations in the courts under the Obama administration, under the Trump administration, now under Biden, but also as an undocumented person myself. I came to this country at the age of 8, forced to migrate with my family from Mexico for a lot of the reasons that Desiree already mentioned. The North American Free Trade Agreement expelled me and my family from the countryside in Mexico. In fact, between 1994 and 2006, 10 million campesinos from Mexico were expelled. So me and millions of immigrants now in this country who have been forced to leave are in this dire situation in the United States. And I'd like to speak a little bit about a couple of questions. I want to speak about what's going on at the border, especially now under the Biden administration. I want to talk about the detention centers. And finally, I want to talk about the legalization struggle. First and foremost, what's happening at the border is a humanitarian crisis. And I won't go into the root causes that's forcing people to migrate. I think Desiree spoke about that at length already, but I want to clarify about what is happening at the border and what isn't happening at the border, because there's been a lot of confusion under the Biden administration. So first and foremost, what's happening with the children? If people remember, when the Biden administration came into office, he enacted an executive order that said he was going to create a task force to reunite the families and reunite the children. Just last week, there was a filing in federal court where the Biden administration admitted that hundreds of children have not been found. And so this is what's still happening. There's still hundreds of children that the Biden administration has been unable to find, hundreds of children that have been unable to be reunified with their families. Again, this is because these were families that were separated, families who were deported. The Biden administration has made very little headway on this front. This needs to be a central demand of our movements, the reunification of children, the reunification of families at the border. Now, it's not just the Biden administration's inability to fix the problems of the past administration. There's also a second problem that actually the Biden administration is making significantly worse at the border. And that is essentially that the Biden administration continues to separate families through another means. And what do I mean by this? So first, the Biden administration is continuing to enforce Title 42, which essentially closes the border, which basically prevents people from their right to apply for asylum when they come to the US-Mexico border or to any border, including the northern border in the United States. And what this does is that it essentially prevents people from not only their right under US law, but their right under international law that gives them the right to seek asylum in this country. And so right now there is no right to asylum at the border because Title 42 is continuing to be enforced by the Biden administration. What this is doing in practice is the following, because there's been so far 600,000 migrants as of yesterday that have been expelled and prevented from applying for asylum at the border. This needs to be a central demand. The right to asylum needs to be respected for all the refugees that are fleeing violence, that are fleeing economic destruction in their countries, and they're fleeing environmental destruction. And these problems are only going to be exacerbated as we continue to face the economic crises of this pandemic and onwards. So this needs to be a central demand. The second thing that the Biden administration is doing is that by preventing adults from applying for asylum, what's happening is that it's putting immigrant families in the untenable position, in the impossible position where they have to choose the welfare of their children over family reunification. So what this means is that thousands of children have been now presented to the border alone, not because they come to the border alone, but because their parents or their guardians are unable to apply for asylum, but their situation is so dire that children are being put through the asylum proceedings alone. And this is what's resulting in the detention of children at the border, the influx facilities now at the interior. And now there's thousands of children who could have been processed through asylum with their parents, with their guardians, but because Title 42 is still being enforced by the Biden administration because their parents are being prevented from applying for asylum, that children are now being detained in these new influx facilities, in these detention centers at the border and in the interior. This needs to be a central demand. Abolish Title 42, allow parents, allow families to apply for asylum together. That is the only way that children are going to be able to be reunified moving forward. And now, again, I want to underscore this. This is not a Trump problem. This is a Biden problem, right? This is Biden choosing to prevent parents and guardians from applying for asylum. And this is what's causing parents to send their children alone because their parents can't apply for asylum. So again, we need to be clear about this question. The problem with the influx centers, the problem with children being detained at the border is an issue of Title 42. Biden needs to, again, allow people to apply for asylum. It's a right under US law. It's a right under international law that's being violated right now. And that needs to be a central demand of the movement. The other issue is the Remain in Mexico policy also remains in effect. It's been in paper, it's been rescinded. However, the folks who have been waiting in Mexico to apply for asylum have not been allowed to reprocess their applications for asylum. And as people know, there are camps in Mexico because people that were applying for asylum remain in limbo. And what this means for a lot of people, it means that they're subject to tremendous violence from cartels, from tremendous sexual violence, kidnappings, and all forms of violence, not to mention the COVID-19 pandemic, which continues to ravage Mexico, especially in these camps where there's no access to medical care, no access to health care. And so it's a very dire situation at the border. And we need to make sure that we don't lose sight of what's happening just because a new administration is in office. And again, the Biden administration likes to point fingers at the Trump administration to say, this is not my problem. But we need to be very clear that he's making this problem worse and that he doesn't need to do this, right? US law, international law is clear when people come to the border seeking asylum, seeking help, right? That they should have a right to an asylum process. And right now that's being prevented, not by the Trump administration, but by the Biden administration. And again, this is what's causing family separation at the border. Now, secondly, the second thing I want to talk about is the detention centers inside the United States. So far, the Biden administration has deported 302,000 people in its first 100 days. So 600,000 people have been expelled at the border. 302,000 have been deported under the Biden administration. I mention this because this needs to be a key understanding for the struggles that we're involved in, that the Biden administration has not been a lesser evil since he came into office. Now, I'm going to talk about a lot of the comments that he mentioned at his congressional speech just a few days ago. He made a lot of promises about immigration. He's been making a lot of promises about immigration, not just in the campaign trail, but since he came in office. But what's really happening? So 302,000 deportations, 600,000 people prevented from applying for asylum at the border. These are record numbers of deportations already under the Biden administration. These include expulsions of people at the border. Currently at the detention centers, the pandemic continues to ravage these detention centers where social distancing is not possible, where the rolling out of the vaccine is actually a complete mess because ICE is saying that the states are responsible for administering the vaccine in these detention centers. The states are saying we don't have access to these detention centers. ICE is responsible for administering the vaccine. What it means, what's happening is that people are not receiving the vaccine, right? And in situations where they are being provided the vaccine for obvious reasons because of lack of information, people mistrust ICE, mistrust the people that have put them in detention and have been mistreating them from actually administering the vaccine. And so there's a big need in the detention centers to make sure that people have access to healthcare, have access to the vaccine, and more importantly, that they have access to liberty, because detention is unnecessary in the immigration context. And I want to talk a little bit about this. Since the pandemic started in the last year, there's been a large wave of hunger strikes across detention centers. And this is the Free Them All campaign. These are people, because there's been people who have been dying in the detention centers because of COVID-19, who have been mobilizing and again, going on hunger strike, sacrificing their own lives to ring the alarm, right? That people need access to healthcare, that people need to be released into homes where they can, into the community where they can shelter in place, where they can socially distance, and where they can have access to adequate medical care. After this wave of hunger strikes, it's very valiant and courageous organizing inside the detention centers. People successfully were able to win lawsuits. For example, there's a number of lawsuits across the country that actually found that the detention conditions in immigration custody were so dire that they were unconstitutional, because immigration is civil, that the danger to life posed by the pandemic inside these detention centers actually constituted unlawful punishment. Because immigration, again, is civil, you're not supposed to punish people when they're in detention. Obviously, you talk to any immigrant in the detention center, and they'll tell you that there is no difference between the jail and the detention center that they're in. And so we were actually able to win a lot of lawsuits that resulted in thousands of people being released into the community, which showed that, again, there was a community willing to receive people into churches, into community centers, where people were able to, again, shelter in place, socially distance. And at this point, there is currently about 15,000 people in detention centers across the United States, the majority of which are for-profit detention centers. About 80% of all detention centers now are for-profit in the United States. So 15,000. Now, this number is very significant because we're at a very critical juncture in the migrant rights movement when it comes to liberating immigrants from detention. At the height of the Obama administration, there were about 50,000 people in immigrant detention any given day, 50,000. Even at the height of the Trump administration, there were about 40 to 45,000 people in immigrant detention in any given day. Because of the organizing inside these detention centers, because of the victories in the courts that, again, have ruled that immigrant detention under the pandemic is unconstitutional because it poses a danger to life, which constitutes unlawful punishment under our Constitution for immigrant detainees. There are now 15,000 detainees in immigrant detention across the United States. This is the lowest number of people in detention centers since the 1990s. So the critical juncture now is that the Biden administration is now beginning to, after the 100 days have passed, is now increasing ICE arrests in the community again to repopulate these detention centers. And so we have two ways that we can go here. We can either continue to depopulate those detention centers and abolish detention centers, which was a growing demand under the Trump administration. There was a growing movement around that. Or we can go back to the Obama era policies. The movement can fall asleep and we can reach 50,000 people in for-profit detention centers again. We can go back to that again. And so I'm here to plead with folks that this is a critical juncture for the immigrant rights movement. And what we're seeing is that the arrests are taking place again. Just here in the Bay Area, over the last couple of weeks, there's been arrests that have been happening in the community, again, to repopulate these detention centers. Why should this be a central demand for the movement? Not just for the moral reasons that I already mentioned, not just because this is about life or death for people, especially during the pandemic, but because constitutionally speaking, detaining immigrants is supposed to be a constitutional exception. Civil detention under a constitutional framework is supposed to be exceptional. Now, immigrants have been criminalized since the 1990s, and especially since after 9/11, that the exception has swallowed the rule. Because immigrants have been criminalized, immigrant detention is now the rule. Immigrant detention is not necessary. People should not be detained because they don't have the right paperwork. That's why people are being detained. People shouldn't be detained because they're applying for asylum. And so this is a critical juncture for the immigrant rights movement. What I really want to say to folks is that under the Trump administration, there was a growing immigrant rights movement. There were committees, there were assemblies, there were coalitions built in cities and states across the country. We saw it in the protests at the airports against the Muslim ban. We saw it in the protests against the family separations at the border. Again, we saw it with the hunger strikes at the detention centers. And so our movement, again, is a critical juncture where do our movements fall asleep? Not that Biden is in office. Do we retreat or do we go forward and we make sure that we finish what we started? And what I'm here to tell you is that we need to finish what we started. And that means liberating people from the detention centers. Not again, never again should people be detained because they don't have the right paperwork. Never again should people be detained because they're applying for asylum. Never again should children be detained, no matter if they call it a detention center or a influx center, whatever Biden wants to call it, it's a detention center. Children should be with their families, children should be with their communities. And so we need to demand, again, the right to asylum at the border, the right for people to fight their cases in liberty. There's no need for these for-profit detention centers to be profiting off of the back of immigrants. Finally, on the question of legalization, there are 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. Biden promised in his first 100 days to enact legislation to legalize 11 million. In fact, he submitted the Citizenship Act of 2021 to Congress in his first day in office. There's issues with the Citizenship Act that I won't go into, but in general, at least it purported to give a pathway to citizenship to 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country, a central campaign promise of his campaign. What has happened with the Citizenship Act? The Biden administration has now said that he's not going to put forward the Citizenship Act. Instead, what they're proposing are three different separate bills. And so what they're offering is piecemeal legislation. What are the three bills? One of them is the Promise and Dream Act, which would give legalization, a pathway to legalization to about 2 million undocumented people who came as undocumented youth, people like me, the DACA, the Dreamers, also TPS holders. The other piece of legislation is the Agriculture Modernization Act, which would give legalization to about 1 million agricultural workers who meet certain quotas of hours that they've worked in the fields, et cetera. It also expands, this is a very problematic aspect of this law, expands the guest worker program, which again, very few labor protections and essentially gives overwhelming power and authority to employers, to those who obtain visas under this guest worker program. So something that the labor movement needs to be deeply concerned about and needs to weigh in. Now, these piecemeal bills could be passed in two ways. So again, we're talking about legalization for about 3 to 4 million immigrants, the majority of which would be excluded under this new piecemeal approach that the Biden administration, that the Democrats are not pursuing. And this is in fact what he mentioned in his speech in Congress just a few weeks ago, when he said, if you don't want to pass the Citizenship Act, and talking to the Republicans said, at least pass these piecemeal legislations. Now, why is he reaching out to the Republicans? What does it mean when he says to the Republicans to pass these piecemeal legislations? So first, we need to be very concrete about what's going on in Congress. In the Senate, the Democrats have 50 votes, the Republicans have 50 votes, right? And so the filibuster means that in order to pass any legislation, in fact, any progressive legislation you talking about the PRO Act, any progressive legislation here in this country, right? Unless you get rid of the filibuster, all of these bills, all of these promises are dead on arrival. This is true in immigration as well. And in fact, in immigration, there's a second danger, which is essentially that the Biden administration and the Democrats are willing to essentially, without getting rid of the filibuster, to exchange legalization for some, the 3 to 4 million people that we're talking about, TPS holders, dreamers, and some agricultural workers, in exchange for those 10 Republican votes for militarization of the border, more deportations, and more detentions. So we need to be concrete about what it means to negotiate with the Republicans. We need to be concrete about what it means for bipartisan legislation, what it means to have a bipartisan approach to immigration. The Republicans, first, the border's never going to be secure for the Republicans. And if we were able, and if people remember in 2017, the Trump administration tried to pursue actually a very similar tactic, rescinded DACA and tried to ask people and went to Pelosi, went to Schumer and said, I will give you the DREAM Act if you give me the border wall. And in fact, Pelosi and Schumer met with him and said they had reached a tentative agreement on this question. If people remember, undocumented youth, including myself, rose up and said, we will not be used as a bargaining chip. We will not be exchanged for the deportation of our parents, for the militarization of the border. And so that needs to be a central demand now. We can't retreat from that demand. Imagine if we were able to stand up to Trump to now lose this fight because Biden is in office and to exchange legalization for some, for detentions and deportations for everyone else. And so that's the concrete question facing the immigrant rights movement when it comes to legalization. The campaign Legalization for All is exposing this and saying, Biden, if you're honest about legalization, Democrats, if you're honest about legalization, overrule, rescind the filibuster. That's a central demand that not only unites the immigrant rights movement, but that unites all the progressive movements. And this creates an opportunity for all of us to come together around Democrats, overrule, rescind the filibuster, and pass this legislation now. And so I just want to end with that because there's a lot of confusion around that. There's a lot of promises from the Biden administration, but what he's doing is that he's setting up a bipartisan approach to pass some of the most egregious policies when it comes to detention, expanding detentions, expanding deportations, and expanding the militarization of the border. The Democrats are not against these things. It's the 1996 laws that, in fact, the Clinton administration enacted in response to NAFTA because they knew that millions of people were going to be displaced, that they enacted this detention system and deportation system in 1996. The Trump administration enacted no new laws. The Trump administration was using the Clinton laws from 1996 to detain and to deport. It's the same laws that are in the books right now. And so, and if people remember in 2007 and in 2013, when there was promises again of comprehensive immigration reform, when the Democrats put these forward under the Obama administration in 2013, provisions for detention, provisions for increased deportation, provisions for militarization of the border were all included in those provisions in these comprehensive immigration reform bills. So the Democrats are not against detention, they're not against deportations. Again, Obama, 3 million nearly 3 million deportations under his term in office. So we need to be very clear that what they're doing now is that they're going to set it up so that it looks like the Republicans are the ones giving us detention and deportations, and that they're in this position where they have no other option but to negotiate with the Republicans and enact more deportations and more detention. We should not fall for this trick. They can get rid of the filibuster and they can pass legalization for immigrants. The Biden administration can get rid of Title 42 tomorrow. He doesn't need Congress for that. And so again, let's not fall for the broken promises. Let's not fall for the smoke and mirrors that we're getting from the White House and that we're getting from the Democratic Party. I'll end with this. We're not where we were in 2008. This is a good thing. In 2008, we were hit with an economic crisis that put the working class and immigrants on its back foot. Immigrants were being deported, hundreds of thousands. Immigrants were terrorized, went back into the shadows. The level of organization at the grassroots was low. There were still lots of illusions in the Democratic Party. There were still lots of illusions in Obama. We are not there now. We have committees, we have coalitions across the United States, Migra Watch networks, rapid response networks that respond to ICE arrests in our communities. We need to make sure that these coalitions are not dismantled. These coalitions to end the concentration camps, these coalitions to reunite families, to stop family separations must be strengthened, not disbanded. So that's the critical juncture that we're in, is to continue the struggle and to continue to build on the movements that grew under the Trump administration, which exposed things that were already happening under Obama, and that now are continuing to happen under the Biden administration. I will share a few links on the chat for ways for people to get involved with the Free Them All campaign, especially here in Northern California, for ways for people to get involved with people who are organizing at the border, al otro lado, which is organizing with people who again are on these in these concentration camp-like situations at the border, who are organizing with refugees. The fight at the border, the fight to close these detention centers, the fight to legalize 11 million immigrants is at the forefront. And so I will share some of these links for people. And I, again, encourage folks to continue to deepen the struggle in your own communities. We cannot go back to the Obama years. And I'm confident that because of the headway that we've made under Trump at the grassroots and at the exposure that's happened under the Trump administration, that we can go further. And today on May Day, there's tens of thousands of immigrants and workers mobilizing across the country. I believe in a new day, and I think that better days are ahead of us if we continue to mobilize, to organize, and to unite in our struggle. So thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. If Cleveland folks ever need me to organize with, to come talk to undocumented workers, to come help organize, I am here. This fight needs to happen in every single neighborhood, in every single city. And so thanks again, Don, for the invitation. Thank you all for having me. And I'll be around for questions for up until 1 before I have to go to the next protest here in San Jose. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Luis. Very powerful, very informative. We must keep moving forward on and build on what we've already established. You know, the folks opposed to these draconian policies under Trump we're still there. And is there any questions for Luis?
And I have more than a question, is a comment. So, you know, during the Clinton years, there was NAFTA that was passed, and that created that massive migration, right? 10 million Mexicans. And during the Obama years, with Biden at the helm, neoliberalism was again imposed in Central America. So that created the massive migration of Central Americans. So Biden is the person that has been behind the scenes doing all of this. So expecting anything better from him is a big mistake for the labor movement and for progressive. This guy's a warmonger that may drag us into a nuclear war. But in addition to that, he is going to continue to exploit the labor and the resources south of the border. So I think that we need to, you know, join forces and increase the pressure. But I have to say, Biden es peor. I don't see anything good coming from Biden. Thank you.
Luis, my question is, are there organizations, and this is probably what you put in the chat. I see that Michael has a question, sounds like the same one. If we could join forces with some of these organizations, that would be wonderful. You know, this COVID detention is a disaster, you know, detention while COVID. Go ahead, Chantel, there's a question in the chat if you want to take it.
Yeah, Michael Carano, do you want to pose your question?
Yeah, I do. Luis, I was wondering, there's probably a lot of disparate organizations across the country. Is there any work that's being done to sort of unite this in the different communities so that in some way there'll be more of a united effort? You know, I don't know much about that, so.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's critical, right? I think that not just within the immigrant rights movement, but I think within the labor movement and within just social movements in general, that we often work in silos. And so I think there's two key ways of addressing that. The way that it's being addressed in the immigrant rights movement right now is the legalization for all. The Papeles para Todos campaign right now is in touch with, and it's coordinating with, for example, just today, we're mobilizing with folks in New York. In New Jersey, Cosechas is very important organization in New Jersey that went to DC, had a civil disobedience action in front of the White House yesterday. Several undocumented workers were arrested. In fact, today they're out there marching again, calling out the Biden administration for the false compromise that he says is inevitable for immigration. What we are planning to do, and well, before I mention this, folks here, I don't know if folks here, but I know there was folks from Cleveland, Ohio, that actually signed on to a call to action for Inauguration Day for the Legalization for All campaign. I imagine maybe this was some of the folks in this call. There's going to be another call for an immigration Congress to unite all these struggles after May Day. And so again, the folks are mobilizing in New Jersey and in upstate New York with the agricultural workers, folks, all the organizations. There was over 40 organizations across the United States, organizations in over 40 states who endorsed that call to action back on Inauguration Day, saying we need an independent movement, regardless of Biden coming into office, that we're going to call on for an immigration Congress. And this is a movement Congress to unite and to be able to coordinate these struggles on a national level. Because you're right that the struggles around detention centers, the struggles at the border, and the struggles around legalization in different cities are oftentimes disjointed. And so there's a move to do that. And I hope that and again, the perspective here is to be able to build a general strike like we did back in the spring of 2006. Now it's going to take a very high level of organization. Locally, what this means is a lot of political education and organizing with directly affected people. We're talking undocumented workers. And so the Legalization for All chapter here in the Bay Area, for example, is made up of over 100 undocumented families. We're talking ordinary working class families who are politicizing, who have seen this again. They remember the promises that Obama made, and instead they got 3 million deportations, right? And so they're ripe. They're ready for this level of organizing, and they're leading the marches like they led it in New Jersey, they led it in DC. If you look at these actions, it's not young, paid organizers. We're talking working class people entering the stage of politics. This is one of the things that we can certainly provide for folks in Cleveland or in your localities. If you want to organize, and I really want to encourage people that allies need to help organize undocumented workers and together help educate, help provide the tools so that they can self-organize their families, their communities, their workplaces. And that's what we're doing locally. We're going to call for a national Congress after May Day, but the work after May Day to be able to build that general strike is going to be local, right? We need to be able to educate, to bring people in. And I'm more than happy, and people within this campaign are more than happy to provide the resources to come to meetings, to help encourage people, to help lead some of these trainings, and to bring other leaders, other families who are organizing in their own communities to encourage undocumented workers to organize in this way, right? So that's one way that we're looking to join these fights. I think the second way, in terms of how do we unite these struggles, not just the immigrant rights struggle, right, which is what I spoke about, but how do we unite across the social movements and across the working class as a whole? And I know there's a lot of people here from the labor and community for an independent party. Look, uniting around a fight for power, that we need our own elected officials, right? That we need people who are not servient to corporations under the Democratic Party, but people that really represent our own parties, that are rooted in movements, that are rooted in our working class organizations, that are rooted in these coalitions that we're talking about. That's, I think, the way forward. And that obviously is going to take a lot of building and a lot of organizing to be able to do that. But I think that the work that LCIP is doing is very encouraging. The campaign of Connie White in Long Beach, where a Democratic city council just voted to extend a detention center for immigrant children, majority Latinos, right? Latino Democrat city council members sided with detention over the community's demand, and people are mobilizing there. And there's a lot of struggles. There's teachers that are mobilizing in Long Beach, and I know Connie can speak more to this, but I think that is a very exciting campaign where we can build and bring these movements together around an independent electoral campaign to win office, to win power, to have our own representatives in office that represent our movements, that represent our organizations, that are accountable to our movements and our organization. I think I think if that was successful, it could really spark a movement for independent politics across the country. And I think that is a good way to unite the movements, right? All movements for political power, working class power. So I think that's an exciting example of how we can do that. And obviously more is needed, but I'm encouraged by that example.
Thank you, Luis.
Thank you so very much, Luis. I'm going to introduce Sherry Naxon. Thank you for joining us today. Sherry served as a board president of the Caring Club since 2014. She's a licensed independent social worker locally here, and she has expertise in child development, nonprofit management, and community engagement. She serves on the pro bono forensic evaluations of asylum seekers since 2018, as recently testified in immigration court. Mostly a mom, Sherry also works as a freelance editor, pro bono social worker, and a consultant in child development, nonprofit management. She lives in Cleveland Heights with her husband, her daughter, and her dogs. Yes, one daughter.
Yep.
Welcome, Sherry.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to actually share my screen so that we can look at what I've prepared. Now, I am not an organizer, but I appreciate everything that you've created, and I'm enjoying this program a lot. And I really I love what Luis just talked about, because basically what we're going to do is kind of go from that kind of 10,000 foot kind of view of everything and the thousands and thousands of people. And we're going to get granular and look closely at how these policies have affected one person. And so specifically, we're going to be talking about forced family separation at the border. And so this tells you a little bit more about me. I'm not going to go through all the detail on the slides that have a whole lot of writing, but the information's there if you want it. And at the end, I'll give you my email address. If anybody wants the whole slideshow, you're more than welcome to it. I have been doing these evaluations since 2018. I've worked with 2 different organizations. The one where I got my training and my mentorship is out in San Francisco, the Children's Psychological Health Center. And then I am a volunteer evaluator for the Mount Sinai Human Rights Program, which is a really impressive program. And if this topic interests you at all, you might just want to look at their website just to see what they're doing. It's a very large and thoughtful and sturdy program, helping people get the evaluations that they need in order to fortify their legal cases. So the work that Luis and other attorneys are doing, that they use our evaluations to help persuade the court to a more just solution for their clients. So my sample size is pretty small. 17 cases doesn't sound like a lot, but when I talk with other forensic evaluators who are doing this pro bono, 17 over a couple of years is actually a lot. So it's 1 or 2 per quarter. Usually they're not spread out that way. Usually I have too many at once. 10 of mine of these cases were in prison. So the ones in Youngstown, I went out to the Youngstown prison. The ones in Louisiana and New York State, because of COVID flexibility, I was able to do over the phone, or those are all over the phone. In Youngstown, just to echo what Luis was saying, there was an ICE wing in the Youngstown prison, but in all other ways, they're treated as inmates. They may get a couple of extra privileges, like they may get more free access to TV or something. But even when I was there, one time I let my client go to the bathroom, and the nurse came in and yelled at me that I let the inmate go unsupervised down a hallway. And so they really, as much as they're detainees, they're civil detainees, they're treated as inmates. And we want to be really clear about that. It is a prison environment. Going back to those that I've interviewed, most of them were parents. Most of them left their children at home when they fled. And because of technology, people can be in touch with their children to some degree. But the pain of leaving your child when you're fleeing out of fear for your life, there's nothing that can compare to that. And I've interviewed most of the Louisiana cases are moms. They're the women's prisons. And it's excruciating for them to feel like they abandoned a child. And then the ones that I have who crossed the border as children, one traveled alone with a coyote at age 13, which is a remarkable but probably very common thing, that families put together the money and send their teenage daughters. And then they will get a birth control injection in case you're raped along the way. This young woman fortunately was not, but she did not feel that she was necessarily with sturdy, trustworthy people, but she was very lucky to make it without a sexual assault. The other one that I'm going to talk with you about traveled with her father at age 13 and was traumatically separated by border officials. So again, I'm not going to go into all this in great detail. I had it from another presentation, but psychological evaluations are part of the preparatory work for someone who's seeking asylum. It shouldn't be, but for whatever reason, our legal system really scrutinizes the request for asylum. Well, there's a whole lot of reasons why, and it's very oppressive, but one way of countering that is by having a neutral clinician really get to know the case and speak to what really happened, being able to speak to the client's the honesty and understanding the legal constructs so that we can then kind of weave it in together to help the attorney with what they're doing. So these do take a lot of hours, and we write a formal report to the court. Most of us are doing it pro bono, but there are, especially in California, a lot of people who are doing this for fee, which in a community that has more immigrants coming this way, that may be more appropriate. But where we're only getting people who are in prison. And so none of us locally seems to be charging. And again, I have this information. If you want this information, I'm happy to share my slides with you. But this tells you what the evaluation is about. The other thing that we do besides the evaluations on the adults is we do waiver letters, and sometimes that is involving a minor child, because in the trying to fight the removal of an adult, the lawyer can make an argument that it would cause extensive harm to a US citizen child or other relatives. So if someone's a caregiver, if the person who's being deported is the care provider for someone who is medically fragile, then you'd be able to make a case that that US citizen would suffer if the person who's being deported was actually deported. And so that was the nature of the case that I'm going to share with you, not the caregiving, but that a US citizen would be harmed greatly if her father were deported. So it sounds like you're all pretty familiar to some degree with what happens. People come to the border, they present themselves as seeking asylum, and then they are detained. And that's what we've all heard about: the ice box and the Mylar blankets and the concrete floors and the profound isolation. And then they usually go from there to a longer term detention center that has some better standards for care. And then they get their credible fear interview. And then after all that, they get the list of the attorneys that they can work with. So you can see where going back and slowing that pace down, we're able to say, well, that credible fear interview wasn't necessarily valid because this person was in fight or flight because they just like cross continents and fleeing for their lives, and that they've been detained, and all of these are stressors, and so they would not interview well, right? You're sleep deprived, you've been mistreated, you've been greeted with hostility. So this green box shows you this is where children are separated from adults. So we're going to follow the child in this case, but you can picture that her father, after separation, went on through these other processes, and how vulnerable that would be, right? So if my child was taken from me, would I be clear-headed to do my credible fear interview? Probably not, especially if I was sleep deprived and scared of the people who are around me. So that's kind of another presentation we could do. So the client I'm going to tell you about, I met with her as a young adult. So she's telling me all of this in retrospect. The family had a separation previously, where the mom and the other siblings came to the United States first, and Monica and her father stayed. I've changed her name for this. Monica and her father stayed in their home country, and they were doing it in stages, which is really common. Families save up money and they send someone to go first. When that person gets settled, then the next one comes. And so that's not unusual. And so they had managed that separation. It wasn't great, but it was managed. They were hoping that when she crossed with her father, that her US citizen status would mean that he could enter without incident. Noting like this had happened during the Obama administration. So looking at the dates on this, like this is before 2016. And so even at that point, so people would think, well, if I have my US citizen child, they're not going to put me in jail because I have a kid. They come but then they are separated. And so in the case I was saying, here she is all these years later, and his pending deportation is causing great harm. And so this quote is from my actual report, where I said the profound psychological harm of a forced separation from her father at this age as an adult would be a repetition of the worst trauma of her life and would exacerbate her existing mental health conditions, resulting in a risk of self-harm, and also a burden to society in the form of emergency and intensive psychiatric services. And that last phrase is not lovely, right? Like that's basically saying, well, if you won't keep him here for her sake, keep him here because it's going to be an expense to society to continue to provide psychiatric care. And that's in a legal setting, something that we need to be able to do, is to say, here's multiple reasons why it's a bad idea to deport this man. So she was dependent on and greatly attached to her father. She had more of an attachment to her father than to her mom, and they were living separately. So her lifeline was her father. Over 6 years later, so when I'm interviewing her, she still presented as fully traumatized. So all of her scores were high for PTSD, anxiety, and depression. And she lived in constant fear of another forced separation. In her case, I was fortunate to get records from a prior treatment, which is really unusual, but I was able to do it. And what was striking were these quotes at 2 years after separation, at 3 years after separation, and at 4 years after separation, just chronic PTSD symptoms. And this is a high school girl at this point, right? So how do we expect someone who's having flashbacks on a regular basis, suicidal ideation, she's re-experiencing the trauma, having intrusive thoughts, she's supposed to be going to school, right? And then so like it's harming her constantly every day. And it's ongoing fears of deportation. That was her whole worry from age 13 now into early adulthood. Her symptoms day to day as a young adult: difficulty falling and staying asleep, which if you know anyone who has PTSD, that's really common. She struggled with her weight. She wasn't physically active. She wanted to be physically active, but couldn't figure that out, which is common with depression. Social and occupational paralysis. So the anxiety was huge. She kind of just was shutting down, staying in most of the time. And occupational paralysis, she graduated high school. She had promised and could go to community college. She was interested in a nursing program or something like that, but couldn't overcome her anxiety. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And then self-harming behaviors, which again is not unusual when we see all this, especially during adolescence and early adulthood. These are words that she used about being detained in the 72-hour hold with her father. It was a crowded room. It felt like a jail cell. She saw another father and daughter. Then she remembers being separated. She at 13 was afraid she would get tased when the 3 officers came and said, "We're going to separate you from your father." And she didn't, she reacted the way any child would to a forced separation. And so they had to use force and held her father against the wall and handcuffed him. And she's afraid that they're going to use their taser. And then she's moved to shelter. So she was put in a cop car, moved to Child Protective Services, and spent 2 nights in a dormitory. And her biggest concern then was, will my mom find me? Like, I don't know where I am. I've just been separated from my father. How in the world will my mom find me? Well, thankfully, her mom had some resources to look for her through the Office of Resettlement and was able to find her. She was so mad at her mom, and that's lingered in their relationship into adulthood. She felt abandoned. It doesn't matter how long it lasted for. She felt abandoned. She felt like her mom contributed to what happened. And that may be other family variables too. They visited the father in prison before coming back to Ohio. She remembers his blue jumpsuit. She remembers the glass partition between them. And these are her words: "I hated seeing him like that. I felt like it was my fault. And I said, what did you mean? What do you mean? How was it your fault?" And she said, "If I wouldn't have left with the officers, I could have done something to stop this from happening." And I think that point is really important. Children always think they could have done something to stop something horrible from happening to someone else. You and I know that a 13-year-old could not have done a single thing to stop. And even her as a young adult looking back, she can't use that logic that just, well, what could you have done to change these 3 officers doing what they're doing? But she still carried that with her. Like, I must have done something wrong because I left. Well, she was forced to leave. She didn't choose to leave. So even with, this was a relatively short experience in shelter, so just 2 days compared to the kids who are sheltered for months and months, these children who have not been reunited with their families, for example, like what are they going through if this is 2 days, the damage caused by 2 days? She had the capacity to recollect in retrospect as a young adult who has a real sense of justice. So she was very conversational, critical thinker, she has a lot of assets for managing this. And look at how much she's still suffering this long-term disabling impact. And then what I wanted to come back to, the threat of pending deportation becomes a menace to the next generation. So the parents who work so hard to have their children grow up in the land of opportunity, the children don't feel like they can actually act on it because it's almost like getting something good out of something horrible that's happened to their family. So that freedom to be like, I have promised I can go to that community college. I can do, this is what they fought for. And she feels like there's something disloyal by being the only member of her family because her siblings don't have it better. They're older. And so I don't believe that they have US citizenship status. So she's the only one. And that inability to act on it is part of the legacy of these policies, that they don't feel the freedom to try. It doesn't feel safe and it feels disloyal. And so these are my words here. You know, I believe that the harm done is irreversible. This is one case, like 2 days of shelter, and I see the harm has had profound impact on her. And so when we take that back out to, you know, the bird's eye view and thousands of kids impacted by these policies, and I haven't even told you the harm done to the adults by that separation, it is needless and it is cruel, and it's not the way that we should be treating people who are legitimately seeking asylum. There's nothing criminal about seeking asylum. So here's my information if anybody wants the slides. I think I went over on my time and I apologize for that, but I'm happy to answer questions if that's helpful. And if you need me to go back to a slide, I'll keep this up for a couple minutes.
Thank you, Sherry. And you didn't go over too much and it's all fine. So
Cool.
you're all good. I appreciate your very informative, very moving presentation. The pain out there is just so tremendous. If folks could hold their questions, Sherry, we're gonna have Valdemar speak next. And
Okay.
if you could stick on for some questions after that, that'd be wonderful.
Absolutely.
Now, at this time, I will introduce Farm Labor Organizing Committee President Valdemar Velasquez. Sorry, my Spanish is not great. Valdemar founded the Farm Labor Organizing Committee in 1967. Under his leadership, FLOC has set international precedents in the labor industry, including being the first union to negotiate multi-party collective bargaining agreements and the first to represent H-2A international guest workers under a labor agreement. Valdemar, an internationally recognized leader in the farm worker and immigrants' rights movement, is committed to justice and human dignity. His work has been recognized by many labor, government, academic, and progressive organizations, including John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Fellowship, Genius Grant, Development of People Award by the Campaign for Human Development of the U.S. Catholic Conference, and Aguila Azteca Award by the Government of Mexico, and several honorary doctorates from Bowling Green State University, Bluffton University, University of Toledo. In 2009, Valdemar was elected to the AFL-CIO Executive Council. Welcome today, Valdemar. Thank you for joining us again. I've had the pleasure of working alongside Valdemar over the last few years on some of these issues.
Thank you, Don. Greetings, everyone. Saludos a todos. I've listened to some of the previous speakers, and I don't think there's much left to say, really. When I can say I agree with everything that's been said. So I think the issue of the oppression of poor people, forced migration, the marginalization of people is a global issue. It's not a U.S. issue. And we see people migrating from one place to another like water to a dry spot because they flee exploitation, oppression, violence. They push to find a way to feed their families, educate and clothe their families. It's just all a very natural human thing to do for a family to want to be together, but pressures are put upon them were rightfully described in terms of our foreign policy, not only to Mexico and Central America, but globally as well. And you have to know that our global economic policies are designed for investors, and those investors are the ones that drive the politics in this country. I think Bernie Sanders very well had it rightly identified. Other people, previous speakers spoke quite eloquently about this issue. As long as we have the foreign policy that we have, that's driven by both Republican and Democratic parties, these things aren't going to change. We're going to continue to have migrants, immigrants, cross-border, domestically, within the country, and within the sending countries as well. Within Mexico, there's a lot of migrancy from Guatemala and Central America into Mexico. The migrant workers in farm labor camps in Mexico are they migrate throughout the region. So this is not a new problem. We've lived with it since we founded FLOC in 1967. We've always had undocumented people in our union and in Ohio, even before we had our first collective bargaining agreements. I think the challenge is to find a duplicable model of struggle, of fighting, that we don't have to wait for, quote, legislation to give us permission to defend the people. We have to find creative ways to defend the people regardless of our status, immigration status, or it being in the margins of life. We're at a great disadvantage. When we had the Reagan amnesty of 1986, I remember the rallies that we mobilized people for in DC and other places. And I remember telling people, I said, look, this is a right and good thing to do, to fight for this amnesty. But we have to stay organized and pressure to give those immigrants who become legalized certain rights in labor and in society in order to defend themselves. Otherwise, instead of having illegal and exploited workers, we're going to have legal and exploited workers. And for the most part, that's what we see around the country. It's certainly true in Ohio, certainly true in North Carolina, Kentucky, Tennessee, where we're currently organizing agricultural workers. The people who were legalized are in the marginal jobs, trying to find their way up. Some have crept up who have been legalized, but for the most part, they stay in the lower levels of employment and wages. I think the issue of labor rights is very core. Even in the immigration reform, the legislations, the PRO Act, for instance, I was on a call with the AFL-CIO with the head guy that was managing the PRO Act through Congress, and I asked him if there's anything in that bill that transcends exclusion of agricultural workers from the NLRA, and he said no. When the NLRA was ushered into law in 1935 with Franklin Roosevelt, he needed the Southern Dixiecrats to pass the law. And their condition was to exclude agriculture and domestic workers, because at that time, most of those folks were Black. They've been replaced by Latinos, immigrants now. So since 1935 to the present, in every labor law reform since then, we continue to exclude agricultural workers. So there's no focus on extending labor rights to this segment of the population. So consequently, we're still on the margins, and it's very difficult to organize farm worker unions. Other than the breakthroughs that the United Farm Workers have had in California with the law that was passed there to allow them to unionize in California, and now New York recently passed a law year before last, but it's still very difficult to organize under those laws. We in the Midwest, we looked at all these approaches and things, and we decided that the best thing to do is organize on an economic scale to compel the agricultural industries to implement these rights on a negotiated unilateral basis instead of waiting for some framework in the law to allow us to do it. That was our breakthrough in 1986 after an 8-year strike and boycott, where 2,000 of us walked out of the tomato fields and kept that strike going every season for 8 years and boycotted Campbell Soup product for 7 years. And everybody thought we were absolutely nuts. I went to, I don't know if you all remember Monsignor George Higgins. He was the sort of the National Council of Catholic Organizations. It was his the spokesperson with organized labor, very well known in labor circles. And he set up a meeting for me with Tom Donahue, who was then the Secretary Treasurer of the AFL-CIO. So I went to Washington and we met with him. I told Tom, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to get Campbell Soup to negotiate a union contract in their supply chain. And he looked at me and he said, Valdemar, you're beating your head up against a brick wall. Campbell Soup will never sign an agreement with a group of workers that are not their employees. Because when everybody talks about labor unions, they think about employers, employees. Well, that that we have to change that thinking, because a lot of times the employers aren't the ones that set the stratified pricing in supply chains. We have to go up the supply chain, find the people that make the initial determinations of what everybody else is going to get. Now that meeting was in 1985. In 1986, we did what everybody said would not be done. We got Campbell Soup. We forced them to organize an association of all their tomato farmers that they had under contract, so that we could facilitate a three-party collective bargaining agreement. And we negotiated the price of tomatoes to the farmers and how much, and that price of tomatoes to the farmer, what the workers would get. At that time, the minimum wage was $3.35 an hour. In our first contract, we got the wages bumped up to $4.85 in the first contract. That was like a 60-70% wage increase for the workers immediately. And we escalated that the following 3 years. Plus, we got Campbell Soup to buy a health insurance policy for all the tomato workers, not the growers, not the employers. So that was a multi-party collective bargaining agreement. And then we duplicated that with Vlasic Pickle. Vlasic Pickle, we had 5 parties in the supply chain around the bargaining table. We had Campbell Soup. At that time, Vlasic Pickle was a subsidiary, the largest pickle company in the United States. The Vlasic Pickle Company contracted with sizing operations, little pickle companies in Northwest Ohio, 2 of them, as a matter of fact. And they contracted the growers. And the growers then brought us in to harvest the cucumbers. There was a lot of issues in that 15% of the workforce were children under 12 years of age. We had gross violations of the federal minimum wage because everybody was treated as a quote sharecropper and therefore an independent contractor. But you know why the farmers were categorizing them as independent contractors? To save on the employee benefits of workers' compensation, unemployment compensation, and Social Security. That's probably 15-20% of, depending on your size and everything, 15 to 20% of payout for workers that they didn't have to pay. So we told Campbell Soup, and therefore Vlasic Pickle, you have to change this and convert everybody to employees. We negotiated a 3-year transition in the collective bargaining agreement to wipe away the child labor. If you want to get kids, here's the thing. We have a lot of friends in Washington who are great, anti-child labor crusaders, and they wanted to pass a law to make sure that they kept kids out of the fields, things like that. Listen, folks, I started working in the fields when I was 6 years old. It's not that my parents believed in child labor. It's just that the alternative to that was not eating. And so we all had to work. Everything was piece rate. We didn't get paid by the hour. You got paid by the row. You got paid by the acre. You got paid by the container, the hamper, the box, the crate, whatever. And if you didn't work and fill those things, you didn't get paid. You didn't get paid. You didn't have anything to eat. So all the hands were necessary to collect as much as possible. So we told Campbell Soup and Vlasic Pickle, we have to create a sustainable money structure in the supply chain to get our people out of this garbage. And we did that. I won't go into the details. One of these days, it'll be an interesting story to tell how we did all this. But we raised the wages of the workers so that the children didn't have to work in the fields. We renovated the squalor in the labor camps in a public-private partnership we set up with initial money from the companies to, instead of having the one-room shanties that we all crowded into in those days, into kind of duplexes where every family had their own apartment with separate bedrooms and showers for privacy, instead of the common use facilities. And we negotiated with the National Migrant Head Start program to ingest more money into Northwest Ohio to make more space to take in all of the children that were working in the fields. And we did that with an outright output of money first from the companies to rent a public schools so we can get all of the kids space, create the space for all of the kids, get them out of the fields, out of the squalor of the labor camps, give the parents enough money to support the family, and made the companies pay for a health insurance policy. So we didn't have to rely on these migrant clinics, these federally funded migrant programs and sorts. And that's what we say to the people. Our message, hey, listen, all the food stamp programs, all the anti-poverty programs, those programs are for people who are unemployed, who are disabled, who can't work for some unfortunate reason or another. We farm workers are the hardest working people you want to have. Why should we qualify for those things? And if we qualify for those things, that means that the taxpayers are paying the sustainability of these workers so we can keep on providing the cheap labor to the industry. That is not a sustainable issue. Besides, we don't want to be beggars. We don't want welfare. We don't want food stamps. We don't want benevolent contributions. We want a fair day's pay for a fair day of work. And with that, we can sustain our own families and feed our own families and clothe our own families and educate our own families. So we made Campbell Soup, Vlasic Pickle, and then we duplicated that supply chain agreement with Heinz USA, and then Dean Foods and their subsidiaries, Aunt Jane and Green Bay Foods. And then we took on the fight in the South, the Mount Olive Pickle Company. With a 6-year boycott and fight with the Mount Olive Pickle Company, we did that. But we brokered a monster agreement that the company did not want to create a separate growers association to facilitate the collective bargaining agreement, because most of those growers were part of another growers association that was larger than just cucumbers. They brokered with that grower association to facilitate the collective bargaining agreement to call off the boycott. And there we got not only the, I think 83 cucumber farms contracted the Mount Olive Pickle Company in North Carolina. It was part of over 500 growers that grew 32 different crops that we got landed in our lap. And when Mount Olive Pickle Company brokered that agreement. And the main crop that runs through those over 500 farms, which is right now over 600 farms now, we've expanded the representation of the workers in that agreement. That all of those, most of those workers were H-2A guest workers. And the question came out, well, how is an American union going to represent these guest workers here with a work visa that are tied to the employer, and how are you going to do that? I said, look, we don't care what your status is. And I argue with these folks sometimes who are against guest worker programs. I said, that's not the debate. The debate is not that this program is a slave labor program. The point of the matter is these workers are not organized. And yes, they are in a captive situation, but that's the job of unions, is to organize the unorganized. You don't say, I can't organize these unorganized workers because they're guest workers, because they got these restrictions on their visa, things like that. Who gives a crap about that? They're working out there, they're bending over in the fields all day. They shouldn't have their wages cheated. They shouldn't be mistreated. That's what we have to do. We have to organize and represent those workers and use our creativity. Go wild with your mind, your brain, as to what's the way in which we can unite these people to defend them from all the abuses that they suffer. We did that, and we've expanded that agreement. Now it covers about 9,000 workers on 600 and almost 700 farms throughout all of the North Carolina, from the mountains of Tennessee, the Smoky Mountains, all the way to the coast. So it's everything from tobacco to sweet potatoes to cucumbers to even fresh crops like strawberries, wine grapes, and so on. So we're struggling to maintain that, but we're getting attacked. Again, Senate Bill 615 of North Carolina. It is a law that the legislators paid, driven by one of the growers in North Carolina, who's a state senator, that would prohibit clauses in a collective bargaining agreement requiring payroll dues deduction to agricultural worker unions. So they're singling us out. We challenged that under the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. The federal judge just recently ruled against us in that. We're appealing it because it is a direct attack to try to destroy us. But it's also a larger attack on labor, because if the farm workers get a foothold and rooted and grow a union in North Carolina, it sends a bad message in terms of the employers to other employees in the state that, wow, if the farm workers could do this, why can't we organize our plant over here? So I think that we're in the fight for our lives right now. And we're struggling, to tell you the truth, but it's nothing that we haven't seen in the past. Throughout our 54-year history, we've been destroyed, but we get up and fight again. We get destroyed again, we get up and fight again. We get destroyed, we get up and fight again. That's the way it's going to be. And when they tell me, well, won't attrition take over one of these days in terms of all this fighting? I said, no. I mean, this to us, it's a way of life. To us, fighting for these rights is like breathing. If you don't breathe the air, you don't live. So that's what it is to us. We breathe the struggle, and that's our line of life. So I think when I talk about this supply chain collective bargaining agreement, as we're now taking on the big tobacco companies, Reynolds Tobacco, which is now a wholly owned subsidiary of British American Tobacco, there's only like 5, 6 purchasers of tobacco all over the world. 2 of them are in Greensboro, North Carolina, the Alliance One and Universal Leaf. They buy tobacco all over the world. They supply all the tobacco to Philip Morris International, that's based in Switzerland. Philip Morris USA is based in Richmond, Virginia. But they buy the raw tobacco for these companies processing. So this is part of the supply chain that we're taking on. The fact that we're an official union, we affiliated FLOC with the International Union Federation. And we've used that as our movers and shakers to set up audiences for us to connect with our counterparts all over the world. Because if we cannot win for American farm workers, particularly in the tobacco industry, unless we also fight for our counterparts in other countries, because the purchasing of tobacco is global. And they'll buy cheap tobacco over here to mix it with the rich tobacco from North Carolina. And they're finding ways to get that rich tobacco type of grade tobacco in Zimbabwe and Mozambique and Malawi. I've asked the International Union Federation in 2017 to convene a meeting of all of tobacco sector unions to discuss this global issue, this inequities in the supply chain. In other words, if we're going to duplicate the model with Campbell Soup and Heinz USA in tobacco, this time we got to do it globally, because we're going to end up fighting that fight anyway. Might as well do it now. So they've given us a stiff arm for this long. We might as well ask them for everything. And so we did a meeting in Malawi, and we crafted a call to action calling on the tobacco companies to implement a practical mechanism on freedom of association in their global supply chains. That document went to Philip Morris International, British American Tobacco, the 2 big leaders in tobacco manufacturing around the world. I mean, there's 3 or 4 others, Japan Tobacco, and these brokers that I was referring to earlier, based in North Carolina. The international fight is on. We just recently did a delivery of a letter signed by over 500 faith leaders throughout the country, calling on British American Tobacco. We delivered it through the British Embassy in Washington just this last Wednesday. I'm sorry, Friday, yesterday, as a matter of fact. So the IUF is resending that letter to the executives at British American Tobacco in London. And they, as a result, they're beginning to reach out to us. The representative for Reynolds Tobacco has reached out, wants to set up a meeting. I told our Vice President, Justin Flores, to delay him. I don't want to talk to him till this letter hits the fan in London, so that we have some things concrete to talk about. If we duplicate that, or when we duplicate that, I think some things are going to evolve. The first thing we negotiate is neutrality on all the non-union farms in North Carolina, not only North Carolina, but Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Right now, I'm trying to rearrange our undermanned staff to extend these organizing initiatives to Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. If we get the tobacco companies to agree to neutrality, they'll implement that to their growers and their supply chain. What I'm saying is that we have to find alternatives to legislation, not give up on getting good standards and getting legislation and getting elected officials to do the right thing. But we have to create models that are practical, that defend the people now, not wait for someone to give us permission through a law to do it. And hopefully, if we set a precedent with these, it'll make the passage of a law to make those things possible maybe a little easier. No promises to anybody, but we say that we have to go ahead and on our own and try to defend the people as best we can, whether they're undocumented, whether they're guest workers, whatever they are. We need to go forward and organize the unorganized.
Thank you, Baltimore. You're very impressive with your successes, and these are momentous successes for all the workers in our country, especially the farm workers. Chantal is going to take it away with any Q&A. Thanks for sticking on, folks. We're going a little bit over today. Go ahead, Chantal. Any questions?
Yeah.
Baltimore, very impressive, all the work that you've done, and probably, obviously, a lot of work ahead. One thing I was impressed with the international aspect of what, because of course, capital can move everywhere in the world, and if we don't have a sort of international worker coalition, it sure makes us a lot weaker, I guess. What I want to ask you is the AFL-CIO, sometimes I think they tend to be too much internally focused and not look to social movements and things like that. Have you seen any traction with them as far as them working more with social movements to help get some change in working conditions for those who are not necessarily in a union and, that kind of thing? And are they helping financially in any way, I hope? What kind of things do you see on those fronts?
Most of the activity of the national labor is driven by the affiliated unions, the campaigns that they're doing. And I think as a federation, for the most part, it is like an umbrella political front to sort of guide Congress to things that are amenable to organized labor, basic labor rights like the PRO Act, before the Employee Free Choice Act, and things like that. But when it comes to actions and aligning with local groups, that's pretty much deferred to the affiliates. And some have better activity with other non-labor groups than others. Like our network of support to do the campaigns we do comes from not only other progressive elements of the different international unions. There's some very good ones. You heard from Desiree out there in the West Coast. They've got a very progressive Central Labor Council in LA and some of the cities out there, and of course the LACLA, the Labor Council of Latin American Advancement. But all these constituency groups, as you know, are part of the AFL-CIO, and they don't have the authority to move beyond what the international union, the AFL-CIO, puts into practice. So they're limited in what actions they can take. They can do a lot to ally with local community groups and so on. And nothing's going to keep them, from working with labor community group that we're trying to create more foundation for. And so I think that is one of the things that we as affiliates have to expand and do and try to create models that are practical and workable.
Is there any question for Sherry Naxon? Okay. Yeah.
Sherry, I wanted to ask you if we can work together in the future, because we have a lot of work to do, and you're local. Baltimore is in Toledo. And I forgot to mention that. So Ohio, we have a lot of energy and knowledge here. So I just hope we can continue to work together.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for asking me.
Sherry, we have a lot of undocumented people in Toledo, 8,000 to 10,000 just in the city of Toledo. And many of them are associate members of FLOC. And we've been doing COVID vaccinations in our office. We've moved in our partnership with our bilingual school next door to use their gym. And we've gotten all our undocumented people vaccinated. We had to shake the county health officials to release us the vaccines. But now we've got a good pipeline going after they didn't want to be embarrassed by us. We have a very active group of homies. They're kids of immigrant workers, and they're coupled with some of the Black kids and poor white kids in the community. We call them the FLOC Homies Union. And they've been very active. They pushed the city and we did an alliance with the local chapter NAACP, And we pushed together a code of conduct with the Toledo Police Department to undercut some of the tensions with community and police. And then we also got the city to change the lighting system in the city to LED, because it lights up the darkened, neglected neighborhoods where most of our families live. And lo and behold, after the first year of those LED lights, crime dropped by 25% just with the more lighting. And so I think that there's a lot of traction to activate and move people to do stuff.
Yeah, I think I'm so impressed by all of your work. I like, and so strategic. Like the LED lights is a great example, and the supply chain work as well. There is a group of social workers that meets on a regular basis about immigration issues throughout the state, and I think that that might be where the partnership could come in. I know Kathy Ress is on this call now, and she's part of that group as well. But there's so much concern, and there's an eagerness to help on the ground, and then also whatever we can do in terms of policy and advocacy. Absolutely.
We should call an Ohio group together to just have a chat about how we can coordinate some things. It'd be good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that would be really, really meaningful. And I could get you in touch with the person who coordinates those calls, and she could then kind of work with you on a schedule for something like that. There's a standing call, and I'm bad about, I know, like, it goes back and forth Mondays in the evenings and Mondays at noon or something like that. And I know that there would be so much interest in collaborating, as you've talked about, with silos and movements. There's all this energy that if we came together, we could do more. And there's so much investment in helping these communities. So I definitely think we could figure something out.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Sure, thank
If
you.
there's no further questions,
No.
we're getting towards the end of our time. Thank you all for being here. This is not the end of this struggle and this presentation, because I have everyone's email. So we are going to organize, and be in touch. And we did record today, so this recording will be shared. It was a wealth of information. Thank you all for joining us today. And remember, the corporations cross the borders. Why can't the workers? Thank you all. Have a great day. Happy May Day.
Adios.
Onward with the struggle. Adios.
Thank you for watching. For more information about Labor and Community for an Independent Party, visit us at www.lcipcommittee.org.